I am not a sentimental man. I want to establish that early because what I am about to tell you sounds like the kind of story a sentimental man would tell. A story about a child and a choice and a moment at the end where everything goes still. I have heard people tell versions of this story about other events, other people, and they always lean into the warmth of it. They make it soft. They make it easy. It was not soft or easy. Not at the start, and not at the end either, though the end was something I will carry for the rest of my life without minding the weight. My name is Pell Drays. I am 54 years old, which is, by most measures, old enough to know better than most of the things I have done. I have been a shaft foreman on compact extraction operations for 21 years. I started at Herath 4, moved to the Kethsor deep bore site for 8 years, and for the last 6 years I have been running operations at Velora's 7, a mid-grade manganese and compactor extraction facility on a contested moon in the Velkaran Outer Corridor. Compact facility. Velkaran airspace. The kind of arrangement that generates paperwork in 3 administrative systems simultaneously and pays well precisely because no one else wants to be there. I like it. I like the work. I like the shaft. I like the particular quality of silence you get 300 meters underground when the mid-shift machinery is on its rotation cycle, and the only sound is the cooling of the rock, and, if you are very still, the faint bass vibration of the planet's own internal processes working away at themselves in the dark. I have been underground for most of my working life. I have learned to read the language of pressure and temperature, and the faint groan that means nothing yet versus the faint groan that means stop what you are doing and move now. I am good at this work. I am not good at most other things, and I do not pretend otherwise. I tell you all of this so you understand what kind of man found her. It was a Tuesday, or what passed for a Tuesday on a moon with a 19-hour day and a rotation schedule calibrated to compact standard. Second shift, lower secondary shaft, equipment annex 3. I was checking the borehead maintenance logs because the second borehead had been running 3 degrees warmer than specification for 4 days, and I wanted to know if it was a calibration drift or a genuine wear signature before I filed the parts requisition. There is a difference. A calibration drift you correct with a half-hour adjustment. A genuine wear signature on a borehead bearing is a 2-day operation and means reshuffling 3 shifts around the downtime, and I prefer to know which problem I have before I start solving it. The shaft at second shift is loud in the active zones and very quiet in the annex spaces. The annex equipment runs on thermal cycles that are offset from the main shaft timing, so at certain points in the shift rotation, the annexes go nearly silent. Cooling metal, the faint hiss of the ventilation system, the distant harmonic of the main bore 20 meters through the rock wall. I heard something behind the decommissioned locker bank. Not a mechanical sound, not a cooling pipe sound, not the kind of sound the shaft makes when it is settling, something organic, something breathing and trying not to. I am a shaft foreman. I have worked underground for 21 years. You develop a specific set of instincts in that time. My first instinct was gas pocket, a tiny leak from the geology, displacing air in small pulsed breaths, which can sound almost alive. My second instinct was injured worker who had gotten turned around and found an annex instead of the medical bay. My third instinct, as I rounded the bank of decommissioned lockers with my lamp extended, was something else entirely. She was tucked between the third and fourth locker units, knees drawn up to her chest, both hands pressed flat against the wall behind her like she was holding it in place through effort of will. Small. Smaller than I expected a person to be, not child in the abstract small, but specifically, precisely small, in the way that makes you aware of how large you are without having done anything in particular to become large. Lavender-tinted skin that in the amber lamplight looked almost gray. Silver-white hair, matted on one side from sleeping against metal. Eyes that caught the light and did not release it, amber, very large, very still, watching me with the complete and absolute attention of someone who has been waiting for exactly this, and does not yet know whether it is the good version or the bad version of it. She did not move. She did not make a sound. She watched me the way a person watches something that has not yet decided what it intends to do. I said, "Easy." I said it the way I say it to a rattled drill operator who has heard a noise they cannot account for. Flat, matter of fact. Not gentle particularly, just calm. The voice that says I am in charge of this space, and nothing that happens in it will surprise me. Then I set the lamp down on the equipment shelf pointing upward so it lit the ceiling instead of her face, and I stepped back 2 paces, and I sat down on the floor of the shaft annex with my back against the locker units on the opposite side. She watched me sit down. Her eyes tracked the whole movement. I said, "I'm not going to touch you. I'm just going to sit here for a while." She did not respond. That was all right. I had a maintenance log to review. I reviewed it, going through the bore head temperature readings day by day, cross-referencing against the ambient shaft temperature at each reading time, looking for the pattern that would tell me whether it was calibration or wear. She watched me review it with the same quality of attention she had given me when I walked around the locker bank, total, steady, giving nothing back. After about 15 minutes, she stopped pressing her hands flat against the wall. After about 30 minutes, her shoulders came down from around her ears. After about 45 minutes, I finished the log, noted my conclusion, probable wear signature on the second bore bearing, not calibration drift, and got up. I said, "I'll come back." I came back at the end of shift with a ration bowl. Standard facility paste, heated, which is not anyone's preferred meal, but it is warm and it is calories, and the facility kitchen does not stock anything more elaborate. I set it on the floor inside the locker bank entrance, not close to her, not within arm's reach, just in the space. I turned around and walked back to the shaft without looking to see what she did. The bowl was empty the next morning. She had positioned it back where I had placed it exactly. I will not pretend I understood what I had found or what I was doing. I am a shaft foreman, not a xenobiologist, not a welfare officer, not anything with a credential particularly relevant to a small alien child living in my equipment annex. What I understood was, she was alive, she was not visibly injured, she was frightened, and she was alone in a space that was mine to be responsible for. What I did not understand yet was why, or how she had arrived here, or who she was or who she belonged to. I filed an internal incident report on day 2. I marked it as found person, category indeterminate, welfare status unclear, dependent classification requested. That generated an automated response from the compact welfare system that said a welfare officer would be in contact within 7 to 14 days. The outer corridor runs on its own schedule. 7 to 14 days was the practical reality, not negligence. I noted it and kept going to work. In the meantime, I kept going back to Annex 3. I did not push her to speak. I do not generally push people to speak when they are not ready, and I am suspicious of people who do. There is a kind of foreman who thinks that presence requires performance, that you have to be talking, explaining, managing the situation out loud to be doing your job. I'm not that kind of foreman. I sit with things. I wait. I have learned that most problems in a shaft resolve themselves if you give them adequate time and do not panic at them or make sudden movements in their direction. She started watching for me. I noticed this on the 3rd day. She was already facing the entrance of the locker bank when I came down the shaft, lamp swinging at my side. She had repositioned herself during the day. She was no longer pressed against the back wall. She was sitting closer to the mouth of the bank, cross-legged. A piece of insulation cord she had found somewhere wrapped around her fingers in a pattern that looked deliberate. I said, "That's a 4-strand braid. Did you work that out yourself?" She looked at the cord in her hands, then she looked at me. I said, "I'll show you a 6-strand if you want. Takes longer to learn, but it holds better, more applications." I sat down. I took a piece of spare cord from my belt kit and began a 6-strand. Slowly, making the crossings visible, she watched with the total attention she brought to everything. Then she unlooped her own cord and tried to replicate it. She got the first 3 crossings right and lost the pattern on the 4th. I walked her back through it. She watched my hands very carefully. She got it on the 2nd attempt. The tension wasn't even, but the structure was correct, which is the harder thing to get right. She did not speak, but something in her face had shifted. The quality of watching had changed from pure assessment to something that was not yet warmth, but was no longer purely wary calculation either. I have worked with people who do not share a language across 21 years and at least 6 different outer corridor sites. You learn that there are other registers. The cord braiding was language enough for that morning, and I was satisfied with it. I found out much later that she had been in the annex for 4 days before I found her. A transit capsule had clipped the upper external communications array during an unscheduled approach in degraded visibility conditions. The outer corridor, whether on this particular moon, runs to magnetic interference events that can scramble approach sensors without warning, and had gone down in the outer access corridor approximately 800 meters from the main facility. The capsule had been listed on the outer corridor transit manifest as an unmanned cargo container. One of the documentation errors that accumulates in the Velkaran outer corridor with the kind of weary regularity that everyone knows about and no one has yet fixed. Emergency response services had flagged the capsule as salvage and had not opened it for 3 days because the manifest said empty cargo. When they did open it, they found the emergency release had been worked from the inside and the capsule was empty. She had gotten herself out. I do not know exactly how. The capsule's emergency release mechanism was designed for adult hands and required a specific 2-handed rotation sequence that I would not have called intuitive. I found the capsule 3 weeks later when I walked the outer access corridor for a separate reason and saw the impact scar in the rock face of the approach. And I stood there for a long time thinking about a small child working an emergency release mechanism alone in a sealed capsule in the dark, and then covering 800 meters of outer corridor terrain to find shelter. She had survived 4 days on water from the condensate collector on the wall of Annex 3, and whatever emergency ration supply had been in the capsule when she boarded it. The emergency ration supply in a capsule of that configuration is rated for 1 adult for 72 hours. I have no idea what the calculation looks like for a child, but I can tell you that when I first found her, she was eating everything I put in that ration bowl with the focused attention of someone in a caloric deficit. I did not learn any of this during those first days. What I knew was cord braiding and ration bowls, and the particular way she watched me check the pressure gauges in the equipment corridor outside the annex, with a kind of interest that went beyond just monitoring me for threat. She was curious. Under the wariness there was a genuine operational curiosity, the kind you see in people who have a mind that wants to know how things work. On the 5th day, she started following me. Not closely, and not into the active shaft areas. She stayed in the equipment corridors and the annex spaces, which was correct because those were the zones with no active bore operations and no heavy equipment moving. I did not invite this. She simply began to be a few meters behind me as I moved through my rounds. I adjusted my route that first day to keep to the corridors with no active operation traffic, and I did not announce the adjustment or explain it. The shaft runs better when people are not in the way of moving equipment. That was a reasonable operational modification, regardless of why I was making it. She found a piece of chalk on day 6. White chalk, the kind we mark on equipment housing when something needs secondary review, a standard shaft convention. Chalk on the housing meaning look at this before it goes back into rotation. She used it to draw on the floor of Annex 3. I saw it when I came in on the morning of day 7, a careful row of small figures, each slightly different, drawn along the base of the locker bank wall. Then a gap. Then a single larger figure set apart from the row. Then a small figure standing in the space between the row and the larger figure, equidistant. I crouched down and looked at it for a while. I said, "That middle figure, is that you?" She looked at the drawing. She reached out and touched the small figure in the gap, the one between the row and the large separate shape, with one finger. I said, "And that one on its own?" She touched the large separate figure, and her hand stayed on it for a moment before she pulled it back. I did not push. I picked up a spare piece of chalk from the equipment shelf and crouched down to the floor and added a figure next to the small one in the middle. Blocky, the way I draw everything when I have to draw at all, which is rarely. I am not an artistic person. I tapped the blocky figure and then tapped my chest. She looked at the two figures standing together in the space between the row and the large separate one. She looked at me. Then she set her chalk down on the floor carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is marking it. An hour later she picked up the chalk again and added a second small figure next to mine, on the other side from where she had placed herself. Two small figures together, one of them me. I did not know what that meant until much later. On day 8 she spoke for the first time. We were in the shaft corridor outside Annex 2, and I was checking the pressure reading on the secondary coolant line. The reading was low by 2 points, which is within acceptable range but at the edge of it, and I was making a note to check the coolant reservoir levels before the end of shift. She had been following at her usual distance, 2 meters back, watching. She said, in compact standard that was slightly too precise and slightly too formal to have been acquired from casual conversation, "Is this facility your home?" I said, "Sort of. I sleep here, which is most of what home means at my age." She considered that for a moment. Then she said, "I do not have a home at present." I said, "You've got Annex 3 for now. It's not much, but it's dry and the ventilation is good." She looked around the corridor. The shaft has a particular smell, mineral, faintly metallic, with the undertone of the ventilation chemicals that keep the air composition in the safe zone. People who have not worked underground often find it unpleasant. I have not noticed it for years. She said, "I do not dislike it." I said, "It grows on you." She said something then in a language I did not know, a short phrase, 2 or 3 words, with a particular quality to the ending syllable. I recognized it as acknowledgement of some kind because nothing else fit the context and the sound of it fit the moment. I went back to the coolant reading. She stood next to me and watched, close enough that her shoulder was within a few inches of my arm. That was the first time she had been that close. I noted it and did not change anything about what I was doing. This is the part I want to be precise about. People have asked me many questions since the events of the 16th day, and the questions tend toward intention. Did I know who she was? Did I have an agenda? Did I understand what I was doing and what the consequences might be? I want to answer these questions honestly because I think they deserve honest answers. I did not know who she was. I did not have an agenda beyond the operational one, which was keeping the facility running and not having an unregistered dependent minor somewhere in my equipment annexes. I did not understand the political dimension of what I had in the lower shaft because I was not thinking in political dimensions. I was thinking in the dimensions I always think in. What is the immediate situation? What does it require? What is the correct response given what I have available? The correct response, given what I had available, was ration paste and cord braiding and sitting on the floor of a shaft annex for 45 minutes every evening, while a small child decided whether or not I was something she could trust. That is the complete accounting of my intentions for the first 15 days. On day 12, she told me her name. We were sitting in Annex 3 after the end of second shift. She had been working on a 6-strand braid independently all day. I could see the evidence in the slightly reddened marks the cord had left on her fingers from repeated attempts. The version she showed me when I arrived was clean. Better than clean. The tension on the third crossing was more even than I typically get it, and the overall structure was tight without being rigid. "Better hands for it than mine," as I said. I said, "That's good. You've got better hands for it than I do." She looked at her hands, and then at the braid, and then at me. She said, "My name is Sale." I said, "Pell." She said, "Pell." Then, after a pause, "Are humans always called by one name?" I said, "Mostly. Some have more. I have two, but I never use the second one." She said, "I have 4 names. The first is the small name. The second is the house name. The third is the line name. The fourth is the name my mother uses when she is angry." I said, "Is the fourth one long?" She said, 7 syllables. I said, "Then I'll try not to give her reason to use it." Sale looked at me for a moment. Then she said carefully, "You have not asked who my mother is." I said, "Not my business until you decide it is." She sat with that, then she said, "She is looking for me." I said, "I expect she is. Do you want me to help you reach her?" She said, "I am uncertain." I said, "That's a fair answer. The offer is there when you want it." She went back to the braid. I went back to my maintenance log. The bore head bearing replacement had been ordered and was scheduled for the following week, and I was working out the shift reshuffle. The annex was quiet in the specific way it gets when 2 people have said the things that needed saying and are now just occupying the same space without requiring anything from each other. I have found in 21 years underground that this quality of shared quiet is rarer than most people think and more valuable than almost anything they are likely to trade it for. The enforcement team arrived on day 16. I was in the upper operations room when they came through the main entry dock, 4 of them in the formal travel coats that Velkaran official personnel use for off-moon operations, and behind them 2 individuals in the plain gray vest of a civil warrant office. They had documentation. They presented it to my surface coordinator, Onal Cass, before I could get down from the operations room, and by the time I arrived, Onal was already on the communicator trying to reach me with the expression he gets when something has walked through the door that he does not have a procedure for. The lead enforcement officer was a Velkaran man, tall, carrying the particular bearing of someone who has delivered a significant number of warrants and expects the delivery of a warrant to be followed fairly quickly by compliance. He presented the warrant. It was a Velkaran removal authorization under what he referred to as the Provisional Dependent Transit Recovery Provision, citing the Emergency Situation subclause. It named the child, the second of her 4 names, the house name, and authorized her immediate transfer into the custody of the warrant office pending return to the sovereign authority. I read the warrant. I have read a great many documents in 21 years of working at compact Velkaran joint extraction facilities. You develop the habit because the alternative, accepting verbal summaries of documents that affect your operational standing, is the kind of habit that eventually costs you something important. I read documents. I read them all the way through. I read the footnotes. I read the warrant twice. Then I read the issuing section. I said, "This names the Velkaran Provisional Transit Authority as the issuing office." The lead officer said, "That is correct." I said, "This facility is located within Velkaran Outer Corridor airspace. However, it is registered as a compact extraction operation under the Joint Compact Velkaran Mineral Extraction Protocol, Section 11. He said, "The Provisional Transit Recovery Provision applies to all persons within Velkaran Outer Corridor airspace." I said, "Section 11, paragraph 4 of the protocol establishes that compact extraction facilities registered under the Joint Protocol maintain compact welfare jurisdiction over all persons registered as dependent welfare cases within the facility, independent of corridor airspace designation." The child was registered as a dependent welfare case through the compact internal incident system on day 2 of her presence here. The registration timestamp precedes your warrant by 12 days. He looked at me. I said, I am not refusing your warrant on the grounds that it is not a legitimate warrant. It appears to be a legitimate warrant, properly issued. I am refusing it on the grounds that your issuing office does not have jurisdiction over this facility's registered welfare cases. If you would like to contest that jurisdictional position, you are welcome to file through the Joint Protocol Administrative Office at Velorath Station, which should be able to schedule a preliminary hearing in approximately 14 to 21 days. The silence that followed had a texture to it. The warrant officer behind him was consulting something on a handheld. The second warrant officer was looking at the ceiling of the entry dock, which is a thing people do when they are recalculating. The lead officer said, "We are acting under emergency provisions of the Transit Recovery Provision." I said, "The emergency provisions in the Transit Recovery Provision apply specifically to transit zones and designated transfer stations. This is neither. This is a registered compact extraction facility operating under a valid Joint Protocol license. The emergency provisions do not override Paragraph 4 welfare jurisdiction." He said, "You are very familiar with Section 11, Paragraph 4. I said, "I read the Joint Protocol when I took this posting. It seemed like relevant information." He conferred with his warrant officers in a low voice. I waited. I am experienced at waiting. Then Sale walked into the entry dock. I still do not know how she knew they were there. The lower shaft is 300 meters of rock between Annex 3 and the entry dock. The sound separation is good. She had no operational reason to be in the upper facility during second shift. But she was there, standing at the base of the access stair in her oversized maintenance coverall, one of the small ones I had found in the equipment stores, rated for surface-adjacent work, which was the closest thing to a correct fit I had available, with the cord braid looped around her left wrist, watching the entry dock with those amber eyes. She looked at the 4 enforcement officers. She looked at the 2 warrant staff. She looked at me. Then she walked across the dock floor and stood next to me. She reached up and put her small lavender fingers around 3 of mine and held on, not tightly, quietly, the grip of someone who has decided, not someone who is afraid. The enforcement officers were looking at her, then at me, then at her. The lead officer said, in a tone that had shifted considerably from the one he had been using, "Is this the child listed in the warrant?" I said, "I am not in the habit of identifying people to warrant officers whose jurisdiction over this facility I have already contested." He said, "She approached you voluntarily." I said, "People approach me voluntarily fairly often. I'm the shift foreman, they have questions." He looked at me for a long time. The calculation in his expression was the calculation of a man who understands that proceeding with a physical removal when both the administrative and the interpersonal situations have not gone the way he expected is the kind of decision that generates paperwork at a scale he was not prepared for this morning. He said in a quieter voice, "You understand what this complicates." I said, "I understand what your warrant says, and I understand what Section 11, Paragraph 4 says, and I know which one applies here. If you want to proceed with removal, you are welcome to file the jurisdictional challenge." He did not proceed. He gathered his documentation, and the warrant officers went through the entry dock without further engagement. The last thing the lead officer said at the door was, "There will be further contact from the sovereign authority." I said, "I'll be here." Sale held my hand until the dock door closed behind them. Then she released it. She looked up at me with those amber eyes and said, "You knew the section number." I said, "I read the protocol." She said, "My mother's people do not often encounter humans who read the protocol." I said, "Then your mother's people have been working with the wrong humans." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "They are going to tell her." I said yes. She said she will come herself. I said I expect she will. She said she will be angry. I said probably. She said, are you afraid of her? I thought about this. I said, I've faced an angry queen of the Velkaran outer house roughly never before, so I don't have reliable data, but I've faced a lot of things underground that were larger than me and I'm still here. I'll manage. Sale considered this. Then she went back down the stairs to the shaft. I went back to the borehead bearing reshuffle. The shift ran normally. The further contact arrived the following morning. I was in the upper operations room, going through the shift assignments, when the external sensor array registered an incoming vessel. Not an enforcement transport. The signature was too large, the approach vector too deliberate. I pulled the registration query, and the initial identifier came back as a Velkaran sovereign transit vessel, and I stood at the operations board for a moment being very still. I went down to the kitchen stores and asked the facility cook to pull the Velkaran dietary compatibility table from the reference files. She looked at me like I had asked her to do something in a foreign language, which I suppose I had. I told her to prepare a meal that would work for both a standard human and 2 Velkaran adults, and to have it ready in 2 hours. Then I went back to the operations room and sent Onal down to the entry dock to handle the initial docking paperwork. I told him to send no one else to the dock without my explicit direction. The delegation that came through the airlock was not large for a sovereign transit visit. 8 formal escorts, and then the woman who did not need the escorts to establish what she was. She was tall in the way most Velkaran are tall, and additionally tall in the sense of being a person whose presence in a room changes the room's accounting of itself. Dark hair threaded through with the formal silver I had learned in 6 years at a Velkaran joint facility, marked seniority of house rather than age. Pale gold eyes that were currently operating at a level of intensity I would have classed somewhere between controlled fury and barely controlled fury. She was given the docking manifest by Onal, who had followed my instruction about keeping people away from the dock right up until the point that someone with a sovereign transit delegation walked through the airlock, at which point his operational judgment apparently reassigned priorities. The manifest listed the facility registration number, the compact extraction license, the welfare case incident number with timestamp, the Section 11 Paragraph 4 citation, and my name. She read it. The way she read it was the way people read things when they are containing a very strong reaction to what the document represents and have extensive practice at containing strong reactions. Then she looked up and saw me standing at the interior access door. She did not look at me the way the enforcement officer had looked at me, which was the look of someone assessing an obstacle. She looked at me the way people look at something they have not yet successfully categorized. She said, in compact standard that was more fluent than the enforcement officers, I am Ren Velkaran Sorvith. I believe you have my daughter. I said, I have a dependent welfare case registered to this facility under the compact welfare system, who has been resident in the lower shaft for 16 days. She said her name is Sale. I said she told me. Something moved across her face, not the fury. Something beneath the fury, something that had been there longer than the fury and would outlast it. She said she told you her name. I said on day 12. She was still for a moment, then she said, take me to her. I said, I'll take you down. The escort can wait at the dock. She did not argue about the escort, which told me something about where her attention was. We rode the shaft lift in silence. I do not fill silences as a general habit. She did not appear to expect me to. Sale was in Annex 3. She had extended the chalk drawing considerably since the morning. The row of figures was longer, and she had added detail to the larger separate figure that I had not seen her add before. She had also added the second small figure to the group in the gap, next to mine, and drawn a connecting line between all 4 of them. She looked up when we came through the annex entrance. She saw me first, the way she always looked for me first when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Then she saw who was standing behind me. She said one word in Velkaran, short, 2 syllables with a particular emphasis on the first one. I do not have that word in my vocabulary. I know what it sounded like. It sounded like a word that had been waiting a very long time for the right moment to be said out loud. Ren Velkaran Sorvith crossed the annex floor in 3 steps and crouched to her daughter's level. I stepped back to the annex entrance. I should have left. I understand that in retrospect. But the shaft annex has 1 entrance and they were between me and it. And I was not going to walk through that to manufacture a privacy that the space did not actually allow for. So I stood at the entrance and did not look at them directly, and paid a great deal of attention to the ventilation reading on the annex wall gauge, which was perfectly normal, and had been perfectly normal for the entire 16 days, and did not require my attention at all. The Queen held her daughter in the equipment annex of my manganese extraction facility, on a floor with chalk drawings on it. For a length of time I did not measure. Then Sale said something, still in Velkaran but short. She pulled back slightly and looked at her mother's face, and then she turned and looked at me. The Queen turned and looked at me. She stood up. She had the bearing of a person whose anger is a controlled instrument, and the instrument had been redeployed. She was looking at me with it. She said, "Why does my daughter hold your hand, human?" It was not a gentle question. The word human came with the inflection of a category, not a name, not an address, a classification. The kind of classification that establishes where a thing sits in the order of things. And the fury underneath it was real fury, the kind that had been building for 16 days of not knowing where her daughter was, and had now arrived at the nearest available object. I looked at Sale. Sale was looking at her mother, then she looked at me. She walked across the annex floor and stood next to me and took my hand again. Same grip as before. Quiet, decided, unhurried. The Queen looked at this. I said, "I don't know exactly. You would have to ask her." The Queen looked at me for a long time. The fury was still there. But it was doing something different now. It was working on a problem, trying to reconcile something. The second look was nothing like the first look. The first look had been the look of someone who has arrived at an obstacle. The second look was the look of someone who has found that the obstacle is not quite the shape they expected it to be. She said, "You refused a sovereign removal warrant." I said, "I refused a warrant issued by an office that did not have jurisdiction over this facility's registered welfare cases. The jurisdictional ground is solid. I will explain the citation chain to anyone who wants to contest it." She said, "You cited Section 11 Paragraph 4 to my enforcement officers, from memory." I said, "I read the joint protocol when I took this posting. I have been at this facility for 6 years. Section 11 Paragraph 4 seemed like something I should have current." She said, "You registered the child as a compact welfare dependent 2 days after she arrived here." I said, "I found an unregistered person in my facility. The correct procedure is to log a welfare incident report." The dependent classification was automatic based on the report parameters. She said, "Why?" The question was single and direct, and not asking about the procedure. It was asking about what had been behind the procedure. I said, "Because she was here and she was alone, and that seemed like the correct thing to log. There are protocols for a reason." She was quiet, a different quality of quiet than the fury. She looked at the chalk drawing on the annex floor. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at the cord braid on Sale's wrist. She looked at the stack of ration bowls in the corner that I had not gotten around to retrieving because the shaft reshuffle had been taking up my administrative time. Then she looked at her daughter's hand in mine. She said, 16 days. I said, 16 days. She said, in a voice that was considerably different from the roar, "She does not hold the hands of strangers." I said, I am not entirely a stranger at this point. We have been working on 6-strand cord braiding. Sale looked up at her mother and said something in Velkaran. I caught my name, or Sale's version of my name, which drops the second syllable and is shorter, and I have come to prefer it. The Queen's expression while she listened to whatever Sale said was the expression of someone receiving information that is reorganizing something they thought they understood. The Queen looked at me after. It was not the anger look. It was not the categorizing look. It was something I do not have a good word for, which is unusual because I am generally competent at reading people. People underground learn to read people. Your crew's state of mind is operational information. She says you sat on the floor. I said, the annex doesn't have chairs. If you sit on the floor, you're at the same level. It seemed like the right approach. She says you showed her a 6-strand braid. I said she wanted to learn it. She got the technique faster than I did. She says you did not ask who her mother was. I said, it was not relevant to the immediate situation. The Queen held my gaze for a moment. The reorganization was still happening. She said, what is relevant to the immediate situation in your assessment? I said, she should have a proper meal rather than facility ration paste. The condensate collector in Annex 3 has been doing double duty as her water supply, and I want to flush and recalibrate it before she uses it again. And someone should inspect the transit capsule in the outer access corridor. The emergency release mechanism took damage in the approach event and should be decommissioned before the next transit season. The Queen looked at me. She said, that is a practical assessment. I said, I am a practical person. Sale tugged my hand and I looked down. She had been watching her mother and me with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, total, unhurried, giving very little away. Now she was looking at me directly. She said, you will come to the meal also. I said, I'll come to the meal also. She said, good. We went up the shaft. The Queen walked beside me and did not perform at the formal escort waiting in the dock. The kitchen had the meal ready. Onal had tracked down the dietary compatibility table from the reference files, which I had asked him to do, and which he had done correctly and ahead of schedule, which is why he has been my surface coordinator for 4 years. The Queen noticed the dietary table on the counter when we came in and asked who had done it. Onal said I had asked for it 2 hours before her vessel arrived. She looked at me. I said, I saw your transit designation on the sensor array. Dietary compatibility review takes about 2 hours if you want to do it properly. She said, you prepared for my arrival while you were also managing an enforcement contact. I said, the shift runs concurrently with everything else. That's how shift management works. We sat at the operations room table. Sale ate with the focused attention of someone who has been living on ration paste for 16 days and has strong opinions about the difference. The Queen ate and watched her daughter and did not, for that hour, perform anything at all. She was simply a person watching her child eat a real meal, in a way that was not for anyone's benefit and was not complicated. I drank my tea and looked at the shaft operations board and did not say anything unnecessary. After the meal there was paperwork, as there always is. I signed what needed to be signed: the compact welfare case closure, the formal transfer of the dependent designation back to the Velkaran Sovereign Authority, the standard facility release documentation. I read everything before I signed it. The Queen stood at the table while I read and did not indicate impatience. When I finished and put the stylus down, she said, you always read everything. I said, documents are what they say they are. It seems worth knowing what they say. She said, my enforcement officers reported that you cited the paragraph number without referring to any document. I said, I read it 6 years ago. Some things stay. She said after a pause, when we could not locate her, I was told that the capsule manifest designated the container as unmanned cargo. Response services did not open it for 3 days. I said, I know. She said, she was alone for 4 days before you found her. I said, I know. She said, and when you found her, you sat on the floor of a maintenance annex and reviewed a maintenance log and did not report the specific individual to the external authorities. I said, I filed the incident report. The welfare classification was the correct reporting path. Reporting her as a specific named individual to an external authority would have required knowing who she was, which I did not. She said, you could have asked. I said, it was not my business until she decided to make it so. She was quiet for a moment that was different from the earlier silences. Then she said, she decided on day 12. I said she did. She said, what did you say when she told you? I said, I told her my name. The Queen looked at the table for a moment, then she looked up. She said, there are very few people who would have done what you did. I said, there are quite a few who would have done exactly what I did. You may have been working with the wrong people. She said, perhaps. The signing was done. The escort arranged the departure. Sale came to say goodbye. I crouched down to eye level the way I had done since the first day because it is the basic courtesy of meeting someone where they are rather than requiring them to look up at you, and she held out her wrist where the cord braid was. She said, I will keep this. I said, it's yours. She looked at me with the amber eyes, steady and direct, and said something in Velkaran. 3 words unhurried with a particular quality on the final syllable. I looked at the Queen. The Queen's voice, when she translated, had in it the thing I had noticed beneath the fury when she first arrived, the thing that had been there longer than the fury, and was still there now that the fury had reorganized itself into something else. She says, you stayed on the floor. I said, there weren't any chairs. The Queen held my gaze for one moment. Then she held out her hand, palm open and flat, the Velkaran formal acknowledgement gesture between persons of equal standing, which I had seen used at this facility many times across 6 years, and had never before been the intended recipient of. I held out my hand the same way. She pressed her palm lightly to mine for one breath, then she lowered it. The escort gathered. Sale went with them. At the dock door she looked back once, the cord braid still around her wrist, with a look I will not try to describe because I am not a sentimental man, and I am aware that I do not have the language for it anyway. The Sovereign transit vessel cleared the dock. I watched it on the external sensor array until it was out of range. Onal said from somewhere behind me, what just happened? I said, a welfare case closed. Go check the borehead bearing installation. I want the torque readings before end of shift. He went. I went back down the shaft. The chalk drawing was still on the floor of Annex 3. I looked at it for a while, the row of figures, the larger separate one, the small figure in the gap, the blocky figure I had added next to it, and the second small figure Sale had added next to mine. The connecting line between all 4 of them, drawn with the careful white chalk of someone who knew what she wanted to say and said it precisely. I told the cleaning rotation to leave Annex 3 as it was. The maintenance log would survive the drawing being on the floor. The borehead bearing needed attention. The shift needed running. I am not a sentimental man. The engineering team arrived 3 weeks later and decommissioned the transit capsule. The team lead gave me a 1-line assessment note. The emergency release housing had a stress fracture from the impact, compromising the mechanism, and the release had been worked manually from the inside. She noted that she had not previously seen a manual emergency override worked on a capsule of that configuration. She did not speculate about the hands that had worked it. Neither did I. I filed the note in the maintenance records. I kept a copy. 2 months after that, I received a formal communication from the Velkaran Sovereign Administration. It was a protocol amendment, an extension of the Joint Compact Welfare Jurisdiction provisions under Section 11, broadening the coverage to include a wider class of dependent cases on the outer corridor. The amendment had been initiated through the Sovereign Authority's Administrative Office. In the formal footnotes, in the language that administrative documents use when they are establishing precedent, the amendment cited the Velora's 7 welfare incident as the originating case. Incident number, timestamp, facility registration number, my name. At the bottom of the communication, below the official seals and the countersignature lines and the amendment language, there was a handwritten notation, more angular than the formal script around it. 4 words in compact standard that no protocol required to be there. Thank you, Peldres. I filed the communication in the compact administrative records where it belongs. I did not throw it away.